I find it helps to learn some about how intersectionality was created as a theory. It comes from Black feminist thought in the United States. The term was coined, used for the first time, by the scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a legal scholar, and we have a video from her this week talking about her own term. But it preceded her, this type of thinking. We can see it in the writings of Audre Lorde and Angela Davis, Black women in the US who didn't use that word, but who talked about the same concept and really explored this idea. And it came from these women's lived experiences. They looked at the world and they found that the way they experienced the world was not accounted for by the way that sociologists and social justice folks at the time were talking about it. And so they wanted to expand on their experience and explain their experience and explore how the world happened for them. And that's where this type of thought arose. So what does this mean? Intersectionality, simply put, is that we are all our identities. They interact. So this is Audre Lorde depicted here, and this is a quote from her. There's always someone asking you to underline one piece of yourself, whether it's black, woman, mother, dyke, teacher, etc., because that's the piece they need. They want to dismiss everything else. Dyke is a term that means lesbian that has been reappropriated here, but is not used anymore, really. But what Audre Lorde is saying here is that she can't just take out one piece of herself. She can't just talk about her experience of being black in America without talking about the way all of these other experiences that she has intersect with them. She can't talk about her experience of motherhood in America without talking about how that intersects with the fact that she is a lesbian, with the fact that she is African American. The case that Kimberly Crenshaw was talking about when she coined this term was a General Motors case from 1976. I'm going to simplify it here because we're not legal studies scholars. In the case of General Motors, they hired people for broadly two different areas. They hired people on the factory floor to make cars, and on the factory floor they had no race-based discrimination. They hired black men and white men equally. There were many black men working for General Motors in the 1970s. And they also had office positions, administrators, secretaries, receptionists, managers, all that kind of thing. And those positions, they had no sex-based discrimination. They hired men and women for those positions. And so, as you may notice, the folks who could not get a job at General Motors were women of color. When black women tried to get a job there, they found they couldn't get a job on the factory floor because they weren't men and only men could work there. And they couldn't get an office job because they weren't white and only white people could work there. And they took this to a judge. There was a court case. And what the judge ruled was that these women couldn't get relief. Their civil rights weren't being violated because the way that civil rights law works in America is you have to identify a single way that you are being discriminated. So when these women tried to say we're being discriminated against because of our sex, GM replied, no, look, we have lots of women working for us. We don't engage in sex-based discrimination. When they tried to say they were being discriminated against because of their race, GM said, no, look, we have lots of black people working for us. We're not engaging in race-based discrimination. And the judge said, okay, those are the two claims you have, and GM can clearly show they aren't having problems in either of those areas, so your court case can't go forward. And what Kimberly Crenshaw observed, what seems obvious now, but it was, an insight that was incredibly important at the time, was that the problem here was not just their race or just their sex, but the way those two combined, the way our society treated specifically black women was different than the way it treated either white women or black men. And we couldn't just kind of sum those together, right? That a new type of discrimination in this case emerged specifically because of the intersection of those categories. So that's the basis of the use of the term intersectionality. It also comes out of the experience that these women were very political, they were very activist, had with the movements of the time. So in the 1960s, you had the civil rights movement for rights for black people in America. And this movement, as I'm sure you're aware, was led largely by men. There were many important women involved in organizing in the movement, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, for example. But all of the public figures, the people that gave big speeches, the people that were known, the people who had leadership positions, if you think about the Southern Leadership Committee, were men. Dr. King being the most familiar example. And so the movement tended to speak to the experiences of black men and how they were discriminated against, which of course was very important, and black women were very much invested in trying to improve the lives of black men. And some of those experiences overlapped with theirs. Some of the ways that black men experienced racism were similar to the ways that black women experienced racism. So there was plenty from that movement that was helpful to them. But what they found was that they also had specific concerns that weren't spoken to by the movement because it was male focused. This is actually a scene from a march, the I Am a Man march. It was for unemployed men, and because black men faced employment discrimination, they often had higher rates of unemployment. This is still true today, but had higher rates of unemployment than white men. And what they were talking about here is the fact that a lot of the way we value men and their masculinity in society comes from them having a job. And so the fact that they didn't have a job was undermining to their masculinity. And so they were appealing to that with the I am a man signs. You can just see one in the background here, in a way that, white men could recognize, right? That white men could say, oh, I also feel bad when I don't have a job. I feel like I've lost my masculinity, so I can connect with this. And that was an effective way of speaking at the movement. But that specifically appealed to this idea of masculinity that was inaccessible to black women. On the other hand, you had the feminist movement. The feminist movement was focused around rights for women, and it was led almost entirely by white women. Again, there were many important black women in the movement having important contributions, important theories, but the leadership, the public faces, the people that directed the movement's wins were largely white women. And they had a similar experience here, that they found that some of the things that white women were fighting for overlapped with them. Some of them were things that they also found that they needed. Some of the ways the movement was fighting for women served black women, but also many of their specific concerns were being ignored by the movement, because it was largely led by white women. And the clearest example of this, we've talked about a little before, was the workplace. For white women, they had been excluded from the workplace since America started, and so that was a source of lost power for them, and so they were fighting hard for the right to work. For black women, who largely came here as enslaved people, who of course were forced to work, and then once slavery ended, still their families required, because of discrimination, because of the poverty, because black men were paid much, much lower wages, required them to work. And so the idea that you would need to work in order to get free made no sense to black women. They've been working since they came here, and obviously hadn't gotten free as a result. And so they found that neither of these major movements, despite the fact they covered kind of half of those identities for them, really spoke to their identity, their problems as a whole. So this is how the movement of intersectionality emerged, is trying to recognize political needs, trying to recognize rights that aren't comprehensible when you just look at people one aspect at a time, when you just look at a single type of discrimination, a single type of identity. But instead we have to understand people as a whole, and the way those identities come together, and the way the oppression of those identities come together in order to make political progress.